So our third week of looking at Daniel, chapter 3 of Daniel. We're not going to do every single chapter of Daniel. Next week we skip to Daniel 6, and that will be our last week for now of delving into this fascinating book of the Old Testament. And what we see this week, or in this chapter, in this episode, that we have seen in what we have read and heard and thought about already, is of an ardent and firm commitment to God on the part of Daniel and of his three friends. And an ardent and firm commitment to them on the part of their God, on the part of our God. And we see this in here with this idea, this actuality that we have here with what Nebuchadnezzar sees of God being with them in the flames. In verses 16 to 17. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. So they have trust in him, first of all. And then, if our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. They have that trust in the first place, that God will be there with them. And then in verse 25, Nebuchadnezzar asks this question, or replies, I see 4 men unbound walking in the middle of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the 4th has the appearance of a god. So Nebuchadnezzar witnesses something that in the furnace, in this fire that he has instructed his servants to make so hot, unbearably, unspeakably hot, that it kills the people that are charged with the rather rubbish job of forcing the bound friends into the fire. And yet in the midst of that, there is this 4th person, this 4th man, who presumably makes all the difference for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that helps them to get through this. It says in verse 25 that this 4th person has the appearance of a god, or in some versions it says, or a son of the gods. I sort of grew up as a Christian in a church where it was insisted that that was actually Jesus. It might have been. It says what it says in the text. It might have been an angel. What I do know is it symbolized and signified the presence of God in that awful situation. That they had this assurance that God was with them, and there was this witness to Nebuchadnezzar and the people of his household to see that God was with them. And so from this, I think we should draw this assurance for us that God is with us in the toughest of challenges that we face, in the most awful and awkward and horrible situations that we might go through. And we might find that we are going through one thing after another. I want us to know, I want us to remember that God has promised us that he will be with us. Again and again he promises us. Again and again Jesus promises us to continue this. We have the promise of the Holy Spirit being with us. We know that God will not desert us. And I know this from my own walk of life at times when I have been down, when things have gone wrong again and again for me, and to know that it is God that has got me through those times. I know this from what I see from having the privilege of walking alongside so many people as in being a pastor, and hearing again and again the testimonies from people of how God has got them through. When I ask, well, how have you managed to get through this really rubbish time that you're having? Or maybe people have even said before I ask the question that it's because of their faith, because without God they don't know how they would have got through. And sometimes, just like there's no explanation here in the text about what it is that the 4th man does, just like there's no explanation of the way in which God does this thing, that they come out, not burnt, they come out actually with their clothes not even smelling like they've been at a bonfire party. They are saved. They are able to get through it, but we don't know how. So we have in this story the assurance of God's presence with us in all things. And the reason why these three men get put in the furnace is because somebody snitches on them, because of an informer. But the reason underneath that is because of two things. One, they will not worship the statue that the king has had put up. And two, they will serve only their God. They say they will not serve any of the Babylonian gods. They stay true to their own God. So we see in verse 18, but if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up. So I want us just to dwell on this notion of being a servant. There seems to be a very important part of why Nebuchadnezzar is so impressed by them, ultimately, and why they are so reluctant and resistant to just go along with, oh, all right, then, yeah, we'll bow down to the statue. We'll just go along with it all. It's because they see themselves as servants of the Most High God. They speak in verse 17 of serving God, of not simply worshipping, but of serving him. And in verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar describes them as servants and distinguishes between worship and service. So Nebuchadnezzar said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. They disobeyed the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God." So what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are about is about service and worship. Anyone can worship. I hope we've been worshipping today. There are things which help us to worship and things which hinder us from worshipping as well. But it's one of those things that it's kind of quite simple, quite straightforward for us to do. We say and sing, don't we? Come as you are. There should be no barriers to it. And there are different ways that we can do it. My mum used to make a very simple creamy dessert that she would always kind of, I was going to say wheel out, that sounds terrible, but she would always prepare lovingly when we had unexpected guests. And it was delicious pudding, but it was quite simple. And I remember she had quite an outspoken friend who came round once, and when she'd eaten this delicious pudding, she asked how my mum, Kate, how she made it. And my mum explained, and then this friend said, "Oh, Kate, so any fool could do it then?" And it wasn't kind of like the, and it wasn't quite the point. But the thing is that there are some things in life which are very simple, which take a bit of application, but which we can do quite simply and quite easily. And, in a sense, any fool can worship. Any of us can do that. And any of us can pretend on a Sunday morning. And I encourage some of us to do that. If you're feeling a bit broken and you can't quite get back into church, say, well, just keep coming, because the face might be followed. If you keep the smiley face up, maybe the rest of your body and how you feel will follow. And sometimes that works. But it does mean that worship can sort of be the easy way. But what about the service? What about the service? That's the thing that Jesus emphasizes. I mean, he tells us that we need to be careful that we don't disown him. Yeah? That we have to know who the Son of Man is. We have to know who he is and recognize him. So we worship him in that way. But he also goes on and on and on about this thing of service. Doesn't use that word always, but shows us in the way that he lives his life, shows us in the way that he heals people, shows us in the way that he washes feet, tells us in Matthew 25 how we are going to be judged when the sheep are going to be separated from the goats. It's not really about sheep and goats, but when we are going to be separated from those that are going to be reunited with Jesus and those that aren't. It's not about how we worshipped, but about how we served. So what marks Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego so wonderfully out is the way that they are willing to serve their God. And I don't know how, it doesn't tell us how they did that exactly. I guess we see that what they do is that they're willing to sacrifice, willing to make a sacrifice. They're willing to take a risk. They're willing to show their commitment. They're willing not to sell out, but to tell out who they are. To declare themselves to be servants of the Most High God. So to be recognized in that way. In verse 26, it says this. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. And so they came out from the fire. He acknowledges that that's who they are. Can we be recognized as servants of the Most High God? Is that how we see ourselves? Because if we don't see ourselves as that, then other people aren't going to see ourselves in that way. There's an advert that I saw on the telly the other night. I think it's NatWest Bank, who say, we are what we do. We are what we do. NatWest Bank saying that it defines, it's kind of meaningless, isn't it? It's kind of meaningless stuff. But maybe we can attach some meaning to that for ourselves and change it from something that is kind of empty and commercial and meaningless and pseudo-philosophy to be something that actually can have some meaning and effect in our lives on how we can serve the Most High God. That what we do, how we serve, can define us. So we can be recognized by other people as being servants of the Most High God. So we can be seen as people that make sacrifices. I don't mean that we go home and, murder the cat and that kind of thing. Please don't. I mean, we make sacrifices in our lives. We're willing to give up. We're willing to give satisfactorily as well. Willing to give sacrificially. Willing to share what we have. Willing to put ourselves out. Willing to take risks. Willing to be somebody who speaks out in a situation. Willing to be somebody that identifies themselves as being a Christian. Not just to kind of say, oh, I'm a Christian, but actually for that to be able to be seen. Because again, it's just saying I'm a Christian might be classed as, that's the kind of same thing as worship, that maybe it's quite easier to use those words. But what are we doing with the rest of our time? How are we actually proving to other people and to God and to ourselves that that's who we are? That's how we can be defined. Worship can be empty if not matched with service. So it's important for us to be defined as servants. It's important for us to act as servants and to think about who it is that we're serving. That we are serving our Creator. We are serving the one who created everything, the one who gives us life, the one who heals us, the one that we sing these songs about and read these words about and pray to. But what are we actually doing to serve that God, our God? How does that actually cash in? What are we actually doing? It doesn't have to be something that we do in church. It could be, and that could be part of it. It could be. There's a bit of worship going on behind me. To be birthday messages coming in. So it can make all the difference of how we define ourselves. And it's so important for us to be recognized by others and to recognize ourselves as servants of the Most High God. So what are we doing? How are we serving? Did you read Romans chapter 12 this week as prescribed? If you didn't read it this week. Because in there, it's not telling us how to look good at worship. It's not telling us about how to learn all the right songs. It's not telling us how to read the right liturgy. It's telling us how to live side by side, how to serve one another as we serve our God. Can we be defined as servants of the Most High God? What are we doing to serve? And who exactly in our lives are we serving right now? Amen. Let's just pray. Lord, pray that you would help us to have that servant heart that we talk about, to follow in the ways of Jesus, our servant King, to not put ourselves first, to help us to really think about what is important. Jesus tells us to we can't serve two masters. Help us, Lord, to realize what is important and what it is that we need to follow, what it is that we need to do. So if there are things in our lives today that we need to sort out, there are things in our lives where we know that we haven't quite managed to do that. Help us, Lord, by your Spirit. Help us to do these things. Help us to serve you. Help us to be more and more a servant of you, the Most High God.